Round chance.
Thank you, David. So, yeah, I'm a freelance consultant working in the UK. I specialise in research management and open access. Previously worked both as a chartered accountant and a consultant for KPMG, and then for several years at a UK higher education institution, the University of Nottingham. So really what David asked me to come and share with you is just some of the experiences in the UK dealing with the challenges of compliance over the last few years. So just to put things in perspective, the UK produces about 6% of global article output. So it's very roughly about a quarter of the size of the US in terms of articles. And what was recently announced last year is a mandate from our Higher Education Funding Council that potentially, I won't go into the details, but could cover most of those articles and require them to be made open access from April next year. And in most cases, that will be through self-archiving, so through a green route. But many of you will know that there's already been policies in place for the last couple of years from the UK Research Councils, from the Wellcome Trust, and those cover around about 30,000 articles a year. So that's only about 1% of the global total, and they're also only looking at a proportion of compliance at this stage. So we're talking about fairly small numbers in the overall scheme of things, but this has been very, very disruptive and very, very challenging within the UK. So this was a slide I just added in based on some conversations. I think people were interested in terms of the level of expenditure. So we are actually at a position in the UK where institutions are spending about 10% on APCs and 90% on subscriptions. So APCs is no longer just that kind of 1 or 2%, a very marginal cost. It's into double digits, but it's becoming a much more significant cost for higher education institutions and libraries. I'm not going to dwell on that, but obviously happy to take questions at the end. So compliance, how hard can it be? Well, pretty hard is the answer. So this is a slide that was prepared by one of the librarians at Imperial College London, and it just illustrates that we have a number of different mandates in place or about to come into place in the UK. And ideally, one article would only be subject to one mandate. In practice, quite often there's multiple funding sources supporting multiple articles, and so these mandates can all come into effect at once. And I won't go through this in detail, but what it shows is that there's an awful lot of boxes that an author might have to tick to comply with all of these requirements, and they're not particularly well aligned. So you have to both deposit an article in acceptance in a repository. You might also have to make it immediately open access and with a CC BY license, and you might have to arrange deposit in a subject repository. So there's a lot of scope for things to go wrong, and as you can imagine, this is tremendously confusing for authors, so there's a lot of burden on the institutional administration to advise and guide authors through this process. So something I did last year, really just looking at one of these policies, which was the Research Council's policy, just looking at what did it actually cost institutions to comply with this policy. And really this was the outcome. So we estimated that it cost about £9 million in dollars, that's around about $15 million a year. And this is just the administrative costs of compliance. So to put this in context, there was about £11 million spent on APCs over the same period. So effectively, institutions spent almost as much on administering this project as actually making articles open access and paying APCs. So it's a very substantial overhead at this point in time. And most of that effort is not actually about paying an individual APC or putting something in the repository. It's cultural change, it's infrastructure change, it's getting the message out there, communicating it, developing new policies. So we estimated about 110 people effectively had devoted all their time for a year to trying to address this problem, and it's only getting worse. The other thing we looked at was just what does it actually take to make an article open access. So as I said, this is a fairly small part of the overall costs, but as volumes rise, this is going to become more and more significant. I won't dwell on all of the elements, but I think the point here is it was taking about over 2 hours for every single APC that had to be paid. So what should be a pretty simple, straightforward process was becoming very time-consuming for authors and for administrators for a number of different reasons. And so we estimated that was costing institutions about £80, $120, $130 for every APC being processed. It's not that much compared to the APC, but this burden is falling on small teams within libraries who aren't equipped to handle this sort of increase in workload. So within that pocket, it's very significant. Green open access, at the time we did this study, proved to be quite a lot quicker and quite a lot cheaper. So it was only taking about 3/4 of an hour to deposit an article at a cost of about £33. Actually, since we've done this study, I think that's rapidly changing because this HEFKey policy that's come into place is now creating more obligations around green open access. And I think one of the key lessons that we've learned is when you have funder mandates, it makes things more complex, it makes them take longer. So actually, if authors are doing this voluntarily, it can sometimes be done fairly quickly. As soon as you're constraining how things are made open access, that introduces a lot more complexity, time, and cost into the process. So just to conclude, I think what are the lessons we've learned from the UK that might be of relevance to the US? Well, firstly, policies can change quickly, but actually publishing practices and culture and infrastructure evolve very slowly. So what we found is the initial policy announcements that have been made have generally been changed subsequently, have been diluted. There's been a lot of pushback for researchers and institutions and publishers saying, we just can't do this. We don't have the infrastructure. We can't change the culture that quickly. So there really is an ongoing dialogue between what funders want to achieve and what's possible. So it takes time. There is a significant administrative burden from OA compliance, and that can't be ignored. And it also isn't spread proportionally. So in the context of scholarly communications, it's not that great, but actually where that falls can be a real challenge. So small organizations, whether it's small libraries or small publishers, there tends to be a fixed cost of getting to grips with this that is immensely challenging. And what we're seeing now is institutions are really seeking to pass that on to publishers. So they're saying, we need you to give us much better data. We need you to change your processes. We need you to issue DOIs on acceptance. So there is an attempt to pass some of that burden on to publishers. And lastly, we're already seeing that this pressure to comply is driving investment. So institutions, publishers, they're investing in new systems. It's not necessarily the only driver, but it's really up to the ante in terms of recognizing we've got to have good quality data, we've got to have robust processes, we've got to adopt standards. So I think all of that is something you're likely to see replicated in the US as funder mandates start to bite. So that was everything I wanted to share, but very happy to take questions at the end, I think.
Good, thanks.